Hey friends, welcome to our next module in Global Outreach Fundraising Training, where we believe God provides and fundraising is ministry. I'm CEO John Darnell. Today, Vice President of Development Greg Buell will be leading us. Greg, what are we focused on today?
John, today we're going to talk about the most nerve-wracking part of the process. You have to sit in front of somebody and ask them for money,
Ooh,
right?
no
It's like
thanks.
it's like the worst. So even just like anticipating it, seeing it on the paper, making the ask, just like it makes your heart skip a beat, doesn't it?
It does. It really
It doesn't.
does.
The good news is it doesn't need to. So today we're going to outline a little bit of a construct for these donor conversations to happen that will hopefully maximize their investment in your ministry. So that's really our goal. The first thing I want to note, John, is that there's something about our human nature that one-on-one meetings work the best for this. And not only one-on-one meetings, but also hopefully in person. Now, COVID presents challenges that we've seen in 2020 and are continuing in 2021 to meet in person. So there oftentimes we have to be creative. I saw a webinar yesterday offered by a major donor group that was all about how to make the ask through Zoom. So that's a unique construct, but it can be done, and they're learning how to do it. They're training people how to do it. So the key part here is that we're sitting one-on-one with people, and it really benefits them in two ways. It benefits them in ways that a 200-person Facebook message cannot.
Been there.
Haven't we, John?
We've seen it. It didn't
Seen
work.
it. I was going to say it doesn't work, by the way. Two things come across when you reach out to a person to ask for a one-on-one conversation. First of all, it says that you're important to me. I am willing to come to you. I'm not only going to spend my time and resources to get there, but I'm going to prioritize you in my schedule. I'm not going to have my phone out. I'm not going to be working on other things that day. It's all about coming to you. And our missionaries, John, are going to uniquely have to do that as they talk about their travel plans and figure out how they're actually going to try to go meet with people in person once we get past this COVID pandemic specifically. But that in itself says you're important to me. I'm going to fly out to California to sit with a group of a dozen folks that I know there. That in itself is going to tell them that I think that they're important, that I actually came out to be with them, to have these conversations. Second of all, it also tells them what I have to say is that important. If I am calling you to just chat is one thing, but we don't have important conversations over text, over Facebook Messenger. We have them in person. And so it also reflects to that person and says, what I'm here to present to you today is that important that I came to sit with you. Interestingly enough, John, one of the things that we've learned through our time in fundraising is that the best way to do this is to sit with both a husband and a wife if we're talking to spouses for a conversation. It's interesting that your Nehemiah passage actually talked about that. It's an interesting side note in Nehemiah, where it says the king in the presence of the queen. And I always laugh about that because I think how perfect is that? Like the biblical model carries forward to today that the husband and wife should both be present for the ask. And I just think that's a cool connection point for us to think about. We also know,
Think this though. Just think about it. Somebody asks you, Greg, to invest, to money, whatever. I know you well enough to know that you need to go home and talk to your wife.
Yep.
Right. And so I'm the same way. I get there. Let's say I'm going to go talk to Emily. You're going to go talk to Becky. You get there and all the passion, all the stories, all the emotion, everything we've been talking about, I get about this much of it because I wasn't, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Now I've got to turn around and advocate on this person's behalf to Emily, and what could have been a $250 opportunity or $1,000 opportunity now is hey, why don't we just send them $20?
Yeah.
The passion and opportunity is lost. So, but if Emily and I are there together, we're both moved. We both experience it. We walk away and pray through it. There's a lot higher chance we're going to give significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, we know demographically from research that women are the majority of donors as well. So although a man may write the check, we know that in general, the motivation behind the check is from the female's perspective. Females bond to these stories and these outcomes that we've been talking about they get excited about that, and they really do push couples forward in making that gift. So that's an important factor too. Really, the active ingredient in many of these conversations will be the spouse. So be sure to invite them both to that conversation. The other thing that we want to know about this conversation is that we want to set up our relational connections as the entry point into the conversation. So we thought of reaching out to you because, so John, like, I would love to meet with you and Emily because I love working with you at Global Outreach. I know you're my boss, but you're also my friend. And so I just love to have a conversation about this thing that we're excited about pursuing. That really draws that person in and makes them understand that you value them. But it also can often be a pathway where I can figure out what your passions and interests might be. And so, John, talk to a little bit about the way that you do that as you sit with donors, and how do you think about these relational connections and how they form in successful fundraising?
I'm ready to meet with you. You're so kind to me, one. But, when I think about that would be a current relationship. So that's where we start, our current network, people we're in touch with. Inevitably in fundraising, it gets to a person maybe I hadn't talked to in 4 or 5 years. So imagine the Sunday school teachers that first taught Emily and me when we were first married. So calling them and saying, you know, we thought of you because we were first married. You guys discipled us. We grew more spiritually in that time than, man, almost any other time in our marriage. And really because of that, we've taken this next step in ministry. I mean, you guys were part of the beginning of this, and we want to share with you what God's done with that. So you give them a key role in how God has set all this up. If they have it, it could be an interest or connection, that is in common with the work that's being done, but some way to invite them in and add value to their contribution.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the piece, because not only does that tell them again that they're important to you, but also tells them that you've thought about this and there's a reason you're approaching them, which means that what you're presenting today is important as well. So yes. I bring that whole piece back to the table. Let's jump a little bit, John, to what does an outline for a one-on-one meeting look like? Because I think as we start to plan and think about these conversations, it becomes intimidating at times to think about, well, how do I do that? First of all, how do I get a meeting? But now that I reach the meeting, like I walk into Starbucks. Again, I'm thinking of the olden days, John. Remember that? Like a year ago, and we could go to Starbucks and like sit with people.
I do that.
But walk into Starbucks, like what in the world? Like I might shake their hand or give them a hug or buy them a coffee, but like where do I get started? So we want to provide this outline as a potential outline. This is surely not the end all be all, but it's what we found effective, what others have found effective. And that usually is just some sort of entry points, several minutes spent on just entry points. How are y'all doing? What are your kids up to? How's college going for John? What are those things that we can just have entry points on? How can we chat? What is it like? A lot of people asked my wife and I when we moved out to Global Outreach, what is it like out there in Mississippi? Because we had come from Washington State. So get those relational entry points in here. Make sure you bond. I tend to be a get to business kind of person, John. So I actually have to remember to like get these entry points in. My wife is much better at this than I am, but make sure you spend some time on that. The second thing we want to do is transition, which is where your story often comes in. So we're here today to talk to you about, this is where your mission and your vision, your story, you can start to easily turn things. One of the things my wife and I learned, John, is that if we didn't take one of the early opportunities to then transition, it's too easy to spend like 45 or 15 minutes talking to somebody and just catching up.
Yes.
So I will say, as much as we need to dedicate some entry point time, you also will want to, whether you're single or a couple, figure out in your mind or in conversation with your spouse, at what point you're going to make the turn to this transition, because that is important, because you can do a lot of catching up with folks, especially if you've known them for many years, and not make the transition. So I will note this is a key factor in the part of the conversation where we make that turn and we actually get into what we're here for, which donors appreciate because they know that this is what this conversation is about. You know what this conversation is about. If you don't make this transition, it's more awkward for them than if you would have just gotten on with the point. The next section, the biggest piece of the puzzle here, is that vision casting. It's all the pieces of the toolkit that we've provided you so far in these modules. Vision, mission, stories, outcome. It's all leading up to this, where you're going to spend a fair bit of time outlining what your vision is, what role you hope that this donor can play, how you can make change and impact where you're going, and really outlining that. So this will entail questions. You should leave openings for conversation. You should leave openings for and pauses for relatable stories. They might be able to jump in and say, "Well, I had a friend of our church who served in that country." You want to leave them the opportunities to jump in here as well. And then finally, John, the ask.
Dun, 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 dun.
We're going to talk a little bit about this following this graphic that I have on screen here, but this is the important part. This is where we actually make the invitation. We invite them to invest, and we'll have a couple of key points we'll offer underneath this. But this is the moment of truth, folks. This is what we've worked all this time at, and this is the part where I think we'll see God provide in surprising ways. The exciting part. And then finally, what we're going to cover on our next session, you're going to spend a couple minutes in closing and setting follow-up. So that will be what we're going to move forward to. But let's jump back to the ask, which is maybe the most nerve-wracking part for a lot of folks. John, you've sat with a lot of people as CEO. Does this part still make you nervous?
Every time.
Like butterflies in the stomach, right? Like
I'm driving to meet with the donor, praying the whole way there, like, oh Lord, open the door, provide the segue. I'm praying over like every part of that pie graph, that pie chart that you just showed, like give me a segue, give me an opportunity. Because the reality is, Greg, you showed this like really tidy 30-minute idea of how it's going to go. I went to a meeting recently where the donor was talking, and he's like, hey, let's go to the back of the factory and look at this thing. And I'm like, okay, here's what I wanted to talk to you about. All I shared was the mission and the opportunity. I got 15 seconds.
Yep.
And by God's grace, he ended up giving a $10,000 gift towards that. And I didn't really do anything but show up and be there. And that sort of thing. We have to have our toolkit ready. And it might be a 5-second opportunity. It might be an hour and a half dinner at somebody's house, but understand that we have to get to the ask. We have to put the person on the spot, put where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, John, it reminds me a little bit about, I'm a black and white thinker. I said it earlier. So this graph reflected that black and white thinking, but it reminds me a little bit about the concept of playing jazz. You have to know music theory. You have to understand the principles of music and how it works in order to have the freedom to play jazz. I mean, any great jazz player tells you, like, you can't just stumble into jazz. You got to know all the classical pieces and how to play those so you can now improvise. And this is what you're talking about. You're going to have to improvise, but we've provided a framework of how to know the information and have your toolbox ready so that you can improvise. So I love that.
That's right.
So John, we've showed the potential partner their role in the vision. We've led in that whole vision casting section up to this part. Now we're going to ask them to join our team to fulfill that role. So a couple of key phrases that we've learned throughout our time. One, and this is a really key phrase, and it serves as a really nice transition. I found that in our conversations my wife and I have with our donors who support us, that it really is a nice transition. It allows me to have something reliable to say. It's consistent. I don't have to think about it every time. Will you prayerfully consider joining in my investment team? Will you prayerfully consider joining in my investment team? It's not that hard, is it? Like, it's interesting. It's just a question. Now, John, we all have this tendency, which is by asking the question, if I ask you that and it takes you more than about a half a second to say something, what happens to me? I get really uncomfortable.
Woo, man.
Like the sweat starts pouring off my brow, and oh man, that's rough. But we have to allow for this awkward silence. We have to allow them to say yes, because our human tendency is to fill the space. So I just ask you, and I say, will you prayerfully consider joining my investment team? Right about now, I just become uncomfortable. And I'm going to start to make excuses. I'm going to start to tell you it's okay if you don't give.
I know this has been a tough year and a lot of people, I know you're probably you know what? I'm just going to see myself out and leave now.
Absolutely, John. So you've introduced a few years back to us. You introduced this concept that I want you to share with us today about how to avoid that and what commitment we want these missionaries to make with us today.
Yeah, the commitment is no biscuiting.
Did you,
No biscuiting. So
did you
when you
say
feel the awkwardness,
biscuit, John?
don't biscuit.
Okay, biscuit. Okay.
No biscuiting. So this comes from how my grandmother, she was an amazing cook, and I always look forward to going to eat at her house because of her biscuits. So I remember as a kid pulling up in her driveway and getting out of the truck, and you could smell the food before you ever got in the house, right? And you go in, and we called my grandmother Mama. It's a good Southern grandma name, and said, Mama, oh, I'm looking forward to your biscuits. And she says, oh, but they didn't have the right kind of flour at the store. I wanted Martha White, and all they had was White Lily, or whatever. It's like, okay. And then, she opens the oven to check them to see if they're done. I was like, oh, that looks so good. She's like, well, the phone rang when I was putting them in earlier and the temperature wasn't right. And I just don't think they're going to be right. You're like, okay. She gets them out and she puts that towel in the basket and puts the biscuits in the basket and covers it with the towel and puts them on the table. Right. She said, oh, Mama, this is going to be so good. And she says, I'm just not happy with how it turned out. I don't even know if they're any good. You know, so any opportunity I had to get excited about it, she was just slamming me. And you take a bite of the biscuit, and it was wonderful. So I think about when we're in those awkward moments, we have a tendency, we want a biscuit. We want to make excuses. We want to give the donor a way out. We have this awkwardness that we feel, and we start biscuiting. And we say, don't biscuit. So it should be something like, Greg, will you prayerfully consider joining my investment team? Just count to 10 slowly. You can do 10 Mississippi. We're based in Mississippi. Count to 10 in your head. Let the donor answer your question.
That felt like 10 minutes, John. That was only 10 seconds. Wow. Yes. I mean, it's such a helpful tool, like to think about the counting. And generally, your donors will not take that long. So don't freak out. Like, nobody's going to scare you for that long, but provide them the time to say yes. Your donors know what they're there for. You set up this conversation ahead of time. You've invited them to it. This is not a surprise. Make the ask and allow the space for them to answer. So next, John, once we get through that pinnacle moment, we're going to talk about follow-up, and we're going to do that in our next module. But thanks for telling us about no biscuiting when we ask our missionaries to join us in that commitment. You guys can think about that funny story. And meanwhile, it's close to lunchtime, and John just made me real hungry. But we'll join back up for follow-up next.
Thanks, guys.